The grain dole and the population lie. The Roman Empire fed its citizens. That is the story. The annona, the grain dole distributed free or at subsidized prices to the urban poor of Rome, is held up as evidence of Roman civic generosity, the benevolent state feeding its people. What the state did not tell its people was that the grain dole was not charity. It was population control, political sedation, and economic management. And the numbers used to justify it were manipulated with a sophistication that modern governments would recognize immediately. The official census figures for the city of Rome at its imperial peak, variously estimated at between 1 million and 1.2 million people, were used to calculate grain allocations from Egypt and North Africa, to justify military recruitment quotas, and to establish the political weight of the Roman urban plebs in calculations of public order. These figures appear in official documents, in the records of grain administrators, and in the estimates of ancient writers like Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus. They were the basis of enormous imperial expenditure. The problem, identified by modern demographers, including Elio Locascio and Walter Scheidel in foundational work published in the 1990s and 2000s, is that the census figures appear to measure different things at different periods. Sometimes adult male citizens, sometimes the full free population, sometimes including slaves and freed persons. And the ancient administrators may have been aware of this inconsistency and found it convenient. A city with a claimed population of 1 million requiring a grain dole, and a city with an actual population somewhat smaller requiring the same dole for political rather than nutritional reasons, would appear identical in the administrative record. The grain dole was distributed to approximately 200,000 registered recipients in the late Republic and early Empire. The registration rolls were controlled by the state. Access to the rolls was a political instrument. The ability to add or remove names, to extend eligibility to loyal populations, and contract it among the disruptive, to calibrate the size of the fed population according to the state's assessment of threat and need. Emperors who wanted popular support expanded the rolls. Emperors who wanted to signal fiscal strength contracted them. The numbers moved not because the population moved, but because the political calculation moved. What Roman citizens were never told, because the administrative apparatus was too complex for any individual citizen to audit, and because no independent press existed to investigate, was that the grain they received was not a gift from a benevolent state. It was purchased with a tithe, extracted from the provinces, particularly Egypt, at rates that maintained those provinces in a condition of controlled dependency. The Egyptian grain surplus that fed Rome was produced by a population that paid for it in grain tax, in forced labor, and in the systematic suppression of economic development that might have made them less dependent on Roman administration. Roman citizens ate for free. Egyptian farmers paid for that meal, generation after generation, without the transaction being explained to either party. The logistical reality of the grain supply was understood by a small administrative class, the prefects of the annona, the harbor officials at Ostia, the grain accountants who balanced Egyptian production against Roman consumption. This class knew that the system was not sustainable at its current scale, knew that the provinces were being taxed past their regenerative capacity, and produced internal documents, some of which survive in papyrus fragments, that describe the situation with a candor entirely absent from any public communication. The closest Rome came to telling its citizens the truth was the periodic debasement of the coinage, the reduction of silver content in the denarius that eroded purchasing power across the 3rd century and accelerated the economic crisis that the official narrative blamed on barbarian pressure and military expense. The debasement was the admission, in metallic form, that the system was failing. Citizens experienced it as rising prices and declining wages. The state explained it as nothing at all, because explaining it would have required explaining the gap between what the empire appeared to be and what it actually was. A system that fed 200,000 people while hiding from them who paid for the food, and why it would eventually stop, is not a civic program. It is a management technique. Rome was extraordinarily good at it. From the management of what citizens were fed, we move to the management of what citizens were told. Specifically, the information that the Roman state systematically concealed about the true state of its military. The military casualty cover-up. Rome's military reputation was built on the legions, 8 disciplined, professional formations that had conquered the known world and held it together by force of arms and organizational genius. The official story of the Roman military is one of overwhelming, sustained superiority. The unofficial story, which the state communicated to its citizens through silence, careful phrasing, and the deliberate suppression of specific defeat counts, is considerably more complicated. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD is the most famous Roman military disaster. 20,000 soldiers, 3 legions, ambushed and destroyed in 3 days by Germanic tribes under the command of Arminius, a former Roman auxiliary officer who used his training against his employers. The Emperor Augustus reportedly wandered his palace for months after the news arrived, crying, "Varus, give me back my legions." This much is documented because the scale of the defeat was too large to conceal from the senatorial class who had sons and nephews in those legions. What was concealed in ways that only become visible through cross-referencing sources that the Roman state did not intend to be read together was the pattern of smaller defeats that surrounded the major ones. The Roman military reporting system operated through dispatches sent from field commanders to Rome, dispatches that were read by the emperor and his advisors, summarized for senatorial communication, and represented to the public through the mechanism of triumphs, monuments, and official announcements. In this chain, every step offered an opportunity to adjust the picture. Adrian Goldsworthy, in his study of the Roman army, has demonstrated through comparison of archaeological evidence, specifically the distribution of Roman military equipment in Germanic and Dacian territory, with official battle records that the loss rates in frontier warfare were substantially higher than the victory narratives suggest. Armor, weapons, and equipment consistent with Roman manufacture appear at sites in Germany and Eastern Europe in quantities that would require more Roman soldiers to have died there than the official casualty accounts accommodate. The equipment didn't walk there. The soldiers who wore it didn't voluntarily deposit it. The specific technique of concealment was the triumph system. A Roman commander was awarded a triumph, the great ceremonial procession through Rome with prisoners and booty, only for victories of specific magnitude. This created a structural incentive to over-report victories and under-report defeats, because the commander's status, his political future, and his family's honor depended on the victory count. The Senate, which formally awarded triumphs, received the commander's dispatches. There was no independent verification mechanism. The dispatches said what the commander needed them to say, and the Senate, composed of men who were themselves commanders or had been, understood the system and applied it to their own reports when they took the field. The 3-year siege of Jerusalem from 67 to 70 AD, documented by the Jewish historian Josephus, who was present on both sides, demonstrates the gap between Roman official reporting and witnessed reality. Roman casualty figures in Josephus's account are substantially higher than in the official Roman narrative of the war, in which Vespasian and his son Titus are presented as conducting a swift, overwhelming campaign against a disorganized enemy. Josephus describes a siege in which Roman assault groups were repeatedly repelled, in which specific units suffered near-total losses in particular engagements, and in which the eventual Roman victory was achieved at a human cost that the triumph procession's framing, with its enslaved survivors and its narrative of effortless superiority, was specifically designed to obscure. The public saw the triumph. They saw the prisoners. They saw the booty. They did not see the casualty rolls. Casualty rolls were administrative documents, held by military prefects, transmitted to Rome for pension and inheritance purposes, and then archived in the tabularium. They were not publicly posted. The family of a soldier who died in an unreported engagement would know. The neighbors of that family might know. The information dispersed through the social network of the poor, who supplied the legions, without ever consolidating into a public account that challenged the official narrative. This is not to say that Rome did not win. It usually did. But the margin of victory, the cost of victory, and the frequency of losses that fell below the threshold of public disclosure were systematically managed in ways that maintained a myth of military invincibility that was the foundation of the empire's political legitimacy. Citizens who believed in the invincibility of the legions did not question the taxes that paid for them, the recruits conscripted to fill them, or the expansion of frontier commitments that made them necessary. The casualty cover-up was not just military management. It was the foundation of public consent. From the management of what citizens were allowed to know about military loss, we descend into something darker. The administration of what citizens were allowed to know about who was actually in charge. The emperor's secret police. Rome had no secret police. This is what every introductory text on Roman government will tell you, because Rome had no formal institution with that name or that designated function. What Rome had instead was a network of informers, intelligence gatherers, and enforcement agents that accomplished every function of a secret police while being distributed across enough different administrative categories to avoid the designation. The effect was indistinguishable from a surveillance state. The architecture was invisible, and the citizens who lived inside it were never officially told it existed. The Frumentarii began as a military logistical corps, the grain supply officers who traveled between legionary bases and provincial capitals, making them the natural carrier of information across the empire's road network. By the 2nd century AD, their function had expanded to include what their commanders' orders described as the collection of useful information, a phrase that ancient bureaucratic language used to mean intelligence gathering on civilian populations, correspondence surveillance, and the investigation of political dissent. They were soldiers with legitimate reasons to be everywhere, carrying legitimate military documents, and nobody told their civilian contacts what else they were doing. The delatores were the civilian complement, the professional informers who brought accusations before the emperor or the Senate for a share of the condemned person's property if the accusation succeeded. Under the treason laws, the Lex Majestatis, which was expanded by successive emperors to cover an increasingly broad range of statements and behaviors. The delatores operated as a for-profit surveillance network whose financial incentive was aligned with the production of accusations. The system created a market for denunciation. Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, described the period of Domitian's reign as one in which trust between friends dissolved, because every conversation was potentially an accusation. He knew of what he wrote. He had survived it. Suetonius documents in his Lives of the 12 Caesars that Augustus, the first emperor, established a personal correspondence network that operated outside the formal administrative structure. A web of private informants in provinces and in Rome who wrote to Augustus directly, bypassing the official channels, about the behavior and opinions of governors, commanders, and prominent citizens. Augustus called these correspondents his amici, his friends. They received no official title. They reported under no formal mandate. The information they provided shaped appointments, prosecutions, and exiles, and none of it appeared in any document that a citizen could have accessed or understood as a surveillance mechanism. The Praetorian Guard, nominally the emperor's personal protection force, exercised a political function that was never publicly defined. Prefects of the guard like Sejanus under Tiberius and Plautianus under Septimius. Severus accumulated intelligence and political influence that made them effectively co-rulers, operating a parallel government whose activities were not subject to senatorial oversight or public accountability. When Sejanus fell, denounced by Tiberius in a letter to the Senate whose specific allegations were never publicly specified, the Senate destroyed his family without knowing the charges, because the charges were state information. The legal mechanism that made all of this possible without ever requiring public acknowledgement was the concept of majestas. injury to the dignity of the Roman people, which in practice meant anything the emperor's advisors decided threatened imperial stability. The law was vague by design. A law specific enough to be understood is also specific enough to be avoided. A law as expansive as whatever threatens the state is impossible to comply with, and therefore impossible to resist. Citizens who never spoke against the emperor, never plotted, never organized, could still be destroyed if someone with a financial interest in their property chose to file an accusation under majestas. The uncertainty about what was forbidden was not a flaw in the system. It was the system's primary instrument of social control. Rome's citizens were not told they lived in a surveillance state because the surveillance state was not organized as a state function. It was organized as a series of overlapping private, military, and quasi-official networks whose combined effect was total, and whose individual components were each, separately, explicable as something innocuous. That architecture, power maintained through distributed, deniable, overlapping mechanisms, was one of Rome's most sophisticated and most durable inventions. From the architecture of control that citizens could not see, we move to the information about the empire's finances that they were never permitted to examine. The imperial treasury's hidden accounts. The Roman Empire maintained two separate financial systems. One was the Erarium, the public treasury, nominally administered by the Senate, theoretically subject to senatorial oversight, the official account of state revenue and expenditure. The other was the fiscus, the emperor's private treasury, whose accounts were maintained by the emperor's personal freedmen, not subject to senatorial audit, and whose relationship to state finances was never formally defined. The boundary between them was determined entirely by the emperor's discretion, and over the first 2 centuries of the empire, the fiscus steadily absorbed functions and revenue streams that had been public, until the distinction between the state's money and the emperor's money had ceased to have practical meaning, while officially still existing on paper. This is not a minor accounting detail. It is the financial architecture of absolute power, built and maintained without any public disclosure to the citizens who paid the taxes that filled both accounts. The primary revenue of the Roman state was the tributum, provincial taxes, collected in money and in kind, flowing from the conquered territories into Rome. Citizens of Rome itself, notably, paid no direct income tax during the Principate. This was presented as a privilege of citizenship. It was also a mechanism of political stability. Roman citizens had no direct experience of the taxation process, no receipts showing what they contributed, no basis for calculating whether the state's expenditure matched its income. The financial invisibility was structural. Provincial tax collection was managed through publicani, private contractors who bid for the right to collect taxes in specific regions, paid the state a fixed sum up front, and then collected from the provincial population whatever they could obtain, keeping the surplus. The system was known to be exploitative. Provincial governors occasionally prosecuted egregious publicani, as Cicero famously prosecuted Verres for his conduct in Sicily. But the structural exploitation, the routine extraction of amounts significantly above the official assessment, was understood by the state, tolerated by the state, and never disclosed to either the provincial populations who paid it or the Roman citizens who benefited from the low tax environment it sustained. The fiscus's specific advantage over the Erarium was that it received revenue from imperial provinces, the wealthy, strategically important provinces garrisoned by legions and governed by imperial appointees rather than senators. Egypt, the wealthiest province in the empire, was an imperial province from the beginning of the Principate. Augustus made it illegal for senators even to visit Egypt without imperial permission, explicitly to prevent any independent senatorial assessment of its revenues. The Egyptian grain surplus, the Egyptian papyrus trade, the Egyptian tax intake, all of this flowed into accounts that no senator, no magistrate, and certainly no citizen could examine. What we know about the fiscus comes primarily from the work of imperial freedmen who kept its records and occasionally, in tombstone inscriptions and manumission documents, left traces of their titles and functions. A freedman described as a rationibus of the accounts held a position that equated to chief financial officer of the empire. These were former slaves, personally loyal to the emperor, holding no official magistracy, subject to no electoral check, managing the finances of the world's most powerful state. Their records were not public. Their accounts were not audited. Their deaths extinguished whatever knowledge they held of the specific transactions they had managed. The debasement of the coinage, which accelerated through the 3rd century AD, is the moment when the hidden accounting became visible to citizens in its effects, if not its causes. Emperors reduced the silver content of the denarius from approximately 85% silver under Nero to approximately 5% by the reign of Gallienus in the 260s. To stretch their fiscal resources in a period of military and political crisis. Citizens experienced this as inflation. The state explained it as nothing, because acknowledging the debasement would have required acknowledging the gap between fiscal revenues and military expenditures that the official financial architecture had been constructed to conceal. No Roman citizen in the imperial period ever had access to a consolidated account of state income and expenditure. No such document was ever produced for public consumption. The finances of the most powerful state in the Western world were managed, from beginning to end, in private, by people appointed at the emperor's discretion, answerable only to the emperor, and never required to explain themselves to the population whose labor generated the wealth they administered. From the finances citizens could not see, we move to the history. Citizens were not permitted to remember. The practice of damnatio memoriae, the erasure of people who had existed. Damnatio memoriae, the erasure of emperors. The Roman Senate had a power that no modern government possesses, the official capacity to declare that a person had never existed. Damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was the legal mechanism by which emperors, officials, and public figures could be erased from the historical record after their deaths. Their names were chiseled from inscriptions. Their faces were removed from portraits and coins. Their statues were pulled down, and the stone reused. Their official acts were declared void. Their names were omitted from public records. Citizens who had lived through their reigns, who had served under them, who had built careers on their patronage, were expected to perform the collective fiction that these people had not been. The practice was not secret. The decrees were publicly issued by the Senate. What was hidden from citizens was the extent to which the resulting historical record was actively falsified, rather than simply edited, and the degree to which the erasure extended beyond the condemned figure to the information that figure had possessed or produced. Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96 AD and was condemned by the Senate immediately after his assassination, is the most thoroughly erased emperor of the 1st century. His name was removed from the Arch of Titus, which he had completed. His face was recarved on numerous portrait busts. His coins were removed from circulation. The senatorial decree that followed his death was sweeping and immediately enforced. What Tacitus, who wrote under the succeeding emperor Nerva and then Trajan, was not able to recover, or chose not to pursue, was the full administrative record of Domitian's reign, which had been archived under his name and was thereafter effectively inaccessible because the name had been declared void. The implication for Roman historical knowledge is significant. The historians who reconstructed the reigns of condemned emperors, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, were working from materials that had survived damnatio in private collections, in provincial archives outside Rome's direct administrative reach, and in the accounts of people who had personal reasons to remember. The official record had been altered. The surviving accounts are reconstructions of an altered record, not a primary record. Caracalla's damnatio of his brother Geta, in 212 AD, demonstrates the practice at its most intimate and most politically motivated. Geta had been co-emperor with Caracalla. When Caracalla had him murdered, allegedly in their mother Julia Domna's arms, the Senate's damnatio decree required not only the removal of Geta's name and image from public monuments, but the active execution of approximately 20,000 people who had been associates, supporters, or simply prominent members of Geta's household. The damnatio was accompanied by a purge. The historical record of Geta's co-reign was deleted. The people who might have given that record texture and specificity were killed. What remained was Caracalla's version. The specific documents destroyed in the process of damnatio are what disappeared most completely. An emperor's correspondence, the letters he sent to governors, generals, and petitioners, and the letters they sent to him, constituted one of the most important documentary records of any reign. When those letters were filed under the emperor's condemned name, they became legally non-existent. A governor who had received a letter from the condemned emperor could not cite it as authority for any action. A contract executed with reference to a condemned emperor's approval was voided. The administrative machinery of governance was briefly thrown into chaos by each major damnatio, and the resolution of that chaos required either quietly maintaining the underlying policy under a different authority or abandoning it. Neither option was documented in a way that preserved the original source. Citizens who had lived through a condemned reign and remembered it, who retained letters, who had conducted business, who had served, were placed in a situation of official amnesia. The man they remembered had not officially existed. The acts he had performed were officially void. The private memory and the official record diverged, and the official record was the one that would be transmitted to subsequent generations and to history. Rome was not the last state to practice erasure, but it was the first to systematize it, to build a legal mechanism for the collective falsification of memory, and to enforce that falsification through physical alteration of the public environment. Every chiseled inscription, every recarved portrait, every melted coin was a small act of official lying directed at a citizenry whose own memories were thereby declared incorrect. From the erasure of emperors, we move to the secret Rome kept about its own founding. The documented evidence that the city's mythological origin story was constructed to replace a history the early Romans found embarrassing. The manufactured mythology of Rome's founding Rome was founded in 753 BC by Romulus, the son of the god Mars, who killed his twin brother Remus in a dispute over auguries, drew a sacred furrow to mark the city's boundary, and populated his new city by kidnapping women from the neighboring Sabine tribe. This is the story Roman citizens were taught. Temples were built to Romulus. The date was celebrated. Priests maintained the cult. Historians like Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus presented the founding myth as historical record, acknowledging its divine elements while treating the chronology and the named figures as fact. What Roman citizens were not told, because the state had no interest in telling them, and the historians who knew better had no institutional support for challenging official mythology, is that the founding story was a retrospective construction, assembled in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC from inconsistent earlier traditions, revised repeatedly to serve contemporary political needs, and presented as ancient fact to a population with no means of verifying the claims. The evidence for this is now well established in classical scholarship. The Roman historian Fabius Pictor, writing in the late 3rd century BC, produced the first formal account of Roman history from the founding to his own time. Pictor was working approximately 500 years after the alleged founding date, and working crucially during the period of the Punic Wars, when Rome was engaged in an existential struggle with Carthage and had enormous political incentive to present itself as an ancient, divinely founded civilization with unbroken continuity from divine origins. Pictor's account of the founding period was not reconstruction from primary sources, because no primary sources existed. It was creative synthesis from oral traditions, local legends, and political necessity. The Trojan War connection, the claim that Rome was descended from Aeneas, a Trojan prince who escaped the fall of Troy and ultimately founded the Latin race that produced Romulus, was even more explicitly a political construction. It served Rome's relationship with the Greek world, particularly after Rome's conquest of Greece in the 2nd century BC. A Rome descended from Troy was a Rome with mythological claims equal to Greece's, a civilization with heroic age ancestry that could meet Greek cultural assertions on their own terms. Virgil's Aeneid, commissioned by Augustus in the late 1st century BC and celebrated as Rome's national epic, was understood by its sophisticated readers as political poetry, a conscious, magnificent construction of the foundation myth in its most perfect form. It was also taught to Roman children as essentially factual. The archaeological record of early Rome is not consistent with the founding mythology's narrative. The 7 hills of Rome show evidence of multiple distinct settlements in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, which gradually coalesced into a unified settlement, a messy, incremental process of village merger that has nothing of the singular, divine-commanded founding in it. The Palatine Hill, where Romulus supposedly drew his furrow, shows Iron Age hut foundations consistent with a small pastoral community, not a city founded by a hero of divine parentage. The population of early Rome, based on archaeological evidence, was a mixture of Latin, Sabine, and Etruscan communities, with significant Etruscan cultural influence, particularly visible in the evidence from the regal period, a fact whose political implications, Rome's early kings were often Etruscan, the official mythology was careful to minimize. The Etruscan dimension is the most actively concealed. The Tarquinian dynasty, specifically Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, were Etruscan kings whose reigns produced much of the infrastructure associated with the early Roman state: the Forum, the Circus Maximus, the first temples. The official Roman narrative presented the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus in 509 BC as liberation from tyranny, the founding moment of the Republic. The liberation narrative required that the Etruscan kings be framed as foreign oppressors rather than as the builders of the city that expelled them. The contributions of Etruscan civilization to Roman institutional development, architecture, religious practice, engineering, the alphabet itself, were absorbed while their source was systematically minimized. Roman citizens were asked to believe that their civilization had originated in an unbroken line from divine ancestors through righteous kings to the Republic's liberators. They were not told that the righteous kings included a dynasty the Republic was built on rejecting, that the founding date was a retrospective calculation, that the founding myth was a literary construction from the 3rd century BC, or that the city itself was the product of an incremental, multicultural process of settlement that had nothing divine about it. The myth served the state. The history, to the extent it was known, was inconvenient. The management of the distinction between them was one of Rome's most durable political achievements. From the management of Rome's own origin story, we move to the management of how Rome's citizens understood the people they had conquered, and what the empire systematically hid about the civilizations it absorbed and erased. The stolen libraries of the conquered. When Rome conquered a civilization, it took the books. This was not incidental to the conquest. It was sometimes the point of it. The libraries of the ancient world contained technical knowledge, astronomical records, legal frameworks, philosophical traditions, and historical accounts that Rome's leadership understood as instruments of power. Controlling those records meant controlling the narrative of what those civilizations had been, what they had known, and what claim their surviving populations had on the territory and institutions Rome was inheriting. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous case, and the most mythologized. Multiple fires, over multiple centuries, have been blamed, credited, and disputed in the historical record. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BC, during the fighting around the royal palace, is the incident most often cited, and it is documented that a fire destroyed warehouses near the harbor that contained books awaiting shipment. Whether those were books from the library itself or a different collection has been debated since antiquity. What is less disputed is that throughout the period of Roman control of Egypt, Beginning after the defeat of Cleopatra in 30 BC, the Alexandrian intellectual tradition was systematically absorbed into Roman imperial culture. With Roman scholars gaining access, Roman patrons funding certain areas of research, and the library's independent institutional capacity being gradually reduced to a dependency on Roman imperial patronage. The last director of the library whose name we know with confidence, Hypatia, the mathematician and philosopher killed by a Christian mob in 415 AD, was not killed over the library's contents. But her death marked the end of a tradition of independent Alexandrian scholarship that had been the primary custodian of the most extensive intellectual archive in the ancient world. What had been in that archive, and what survived its centuries of partial Roman absorption and partial destruction, is precisely what the incompleteness of the historical record makes unknowable. The Carthaginian library was a more deliberate case. When Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, burned the city, salted the fields in legend if not in practice, killed or enslaved the population, the books that survived were distributed. The Senate decreed that the Carthaginian library's contents be given to the Numidian kings, Rome's North African allies. The works of Mago, the Carthaginian agronomist whose 28-volume treatise on agriculture was described by contemporaries as the most comprehensive agricultural manual in the ancient world, were translated into Latin by Senate decree, an acknowledgement that the text contained knowledge Rome wanted to preserve and use. The remaining Carthaginian books, the history, the religious texts, the administrative records that documented 3 centuries of Phoenician civilization in North Africa, were given away and subsequently lost. What survived did so in Roman digestion, as the knowledge Rome chose to extract, rather than as an intact intellectual tradition. The libraries of the Greek cities, Corinth, which Rome destroyed in the same year as Carthage, the cities of Asia Minor, absorbed through bequest and conquest across the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, were treated similarly. Greek books Rome wanted, Rome kept. Greek books Rome did not want, or found politically inconvenient, disappeared in the turbulence of conquest and subsequent administration. The Roman general Sulla took the library of Aristotle from Athens to Rome in 86 BC, reportedly in a state of significant disorganization, and the texts were re-edited and published in Rome in ways that reflected Roman scholarly interests and priorities, not Aristotelian institutional intentions. The Druidic knowledge tradition of Gaul and Britain was addressed differently because it was primarily oral. Julius Caesar documented in the Gallic Wars that Druidic priests memorized enormous bodies of knowledge, astronomical, legal, historical, theological, and refused to commit it to writing on principle, believing that written knowledge was less reliable than trained memory. Caesar recognized the political implication immediately. An oral tradition could be destroyed by destroying the people who carried it. The suppression of Druidic practice in Gaul after the conquest, and in Britain after Claudius's invasion in 43 AD, accomplished what no library burning could have achieved. The knowledge died with the people. No archive existed to preserve it. Caesar's own account is the primary surviving record of what the Druids knew, which is to say, we have the conqueror's description of the conquered tradition, with all the distortions that entails. Roman citizens were told that they lived in the most advanced civilization in history. They were not told that significant portions of what made Rome advanced were absorbed from the civilizations it destroyed, that the destruction of those civilizations' intellectual traditions was often deliberate, or that the books their scholars read were the surviving fraction of a much larger body of knowledge that had been selectively culled by the process of conquest. The Library of Alexandria was not simply burned, it was managed, and what survived that management reflects Roman choices about what knowledge was worth preserving, not the full scope of what the ancient world had produced. From the stolen archives of conquered civilizations, we move to a secret that Rome kept from its own citizens about the most fundamental institution of its economic life: slavery, and specifically about the scale and the economics of an institution that the official culture treated as natural and invisible. The slave economy's hidden mathematics. Rome was a slave society. This is acknowledged in any serious historical treatment of the empire. Roman law, Roman economics, and Roman social structure were all built on the foundation of enslaved labor, and the institution was not hidden in the sense of being denied. Romans knew slavery existed. They owned slaves. They discussed slavery in philosophical texts and legal codes. The knowledge that was hidden, that the Roman state had no interest in making visible to its citizens, was the specific mathematics of the institution, the scale of it, the economics of it, and the degree to which the Roman standard of living was a direct function of a system of mass human exploitation whose true dimensions were never publicly stated. The estimates of the slave population at the empire's height range widely in modern scholarship, but the most carefully argued assessments, including work by Walter Scheidel on Roman slave demography, suggest that slaves constituted approximately 25 to 35% of the Italian peninsula's population at the peak of the late Republic and early Empire. That is approximately 2 to 3 million enslaved people in Italy alone, with millions more in the provinces. The empire's total slave population may have been 7 to 10 million people. In a total imperial population of approximately 50 to 60 million, this means roughly 1 in every 6 to 8 people in the empire was legally property. Citizens were not provided with this figure. No official census enumerated slaves separately from the wider population in a publicly accessible way. The slave count existed in administrative records, for tax purposes, since slaves were taxable property. But those records were held by private individuals, not published. The Roman census famously counted citizens. Slaves were not citizens. Their numbers appeared in private inventories and estate records, not in the public accounting of the res publica. The economic relationship between slave labor and citizen comfort was never articulated publicly, because doing so would have required acknowledging that the prosperity Romans experienced was not the product of Roman industry and virtue, but the product of coerced labor extracted from captives and their descendants. Rome's agricultural surplus, the food that fed the city, was produced predominantly by enslaved workers on the latifundia, the great estates that expanded across the Italian countryside from the 2nd century BC onward. The free peasant farmers who had previously worked that land were displaced by slave-worked estates that could undercut their prices because slave labor had no wage cost. The displaced peasants moved to Rome, where they received the grain dole. The grain that filled that dole was produced by enslaved labor on estates that had displaced the peasants who now depended on it. This cycle, conquest producing slaves, slaves displacing free labor, displaced labor requiring state subsidy requiring more conquest to fund it, was the structural logic of the Roman economy, and it was never stated as such in any public communication. Roman philosophical writing on slavery, Aristotle's natural slavery theory, adapted into Roman thought, and later Stoic writing on the inner freedom of the enslaved, addressed the institution in ethical terms that simultaneously acknowledged and naturalized it, without ever examining the specific economic relationship between slave labor and the prosperity of the citizen class. What slaves knew about their own situation, their conditions, their mortality rates, their resistance practices, their informal economies, existed in an information world entirely outside Roman public discourse. The slave revolts of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, culminating in Spartacus's revolt from 73 to 71 BC, alarmed the Roman citizen class not because they threatened ultimate military defeat. They didn't. But because they demonstrated that the enslaved population had organizational capacity, geographic knowledge, and a perception of its own situation that the citizen class had preferred not to think about. The suppression of the revolt and the crucifixion of approximately 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way was as much a communication to the citizen population as a military operation, a demonstration that the state would maintain the foundational institution at any cost, and that the cost would be borne visibly, publicly, and without apology. The mathematics the state never disclosed was simple. The Roman standard of living was not sustainable on Roman labor. Remove the enslaved workers and the latifundia collapse. The grain dole ends, the construction projects halt, and the household economies of the citizen class, which depended overwhelmingly on enslaved domestic workers, dissolve. Roman civilization, as citizens experienced it, was a function of a specific numerical relationship between free and enslaved people that the state maintained through constant warfare and never explained. From the hidden mathematics of the institution that built Rome, we move to the secret Rome kept most carefully in its final century, the true state of the Western Empire's military capacity, as it faced a threat that the official narrative insisted was manageable: the barbarian foederati and the unspoken deal. In the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the Roman Empire made a series of arrangements with the barbarian peoples pressing against its frontiers that amounted to the gradual outsourcing of its own defense, and then the gradual surrender of its own territory, in a process that the Roman state described to its citizens, at each stage, as a policy choice rather than a military necessity. The truth, visible in retrospect but systematically obscured at the time, was that the empire had run out of Romans to fight its wars, and had responded by hiring the people who were fighting it. The foederati, barbarian peoples settled within Roman territory in exchange for military service, were not a new concept in the 4th century. Rome had long incorporated allied peoples into its military structure, and the legions had always contained significant proportions of non-Italian soldiers. What changed in the late empire was the scale and the terms. The groups being settled were not being absorbed into Roman units under Roman officers and Roman command. They were being settled as intact communities, under their own leaders, maintaining their own legal and social structures, performing military service under terms that preserved their internal autonomy. They were, in effect, independent powers within the formal boundaries of the empire, connected to Rome by treaty rather than by governance. The public communication about this arrangement described it as Roman generosity, the empire extending its protection and its territory to peoples who wished to benefit from Roman civilization. The more accurate description, which Roman officials in the Western Empire understood and committed to internal correspondence that survives in fragmentary form, was that the Western Empire had insufficient military manpower to hold its frontiers without barbarian supplementation, and that the terms required to obtain that supplementation were increasingly favorable to the barbarians and increasingly costly to Roman territorial sovereignty. Stilicho, the half-Vandal general who effectively commanded the Western Empire's military in the late 4th and early 5th century, is the most visible figure in this transition. His correspondence with the Eastern Court, portions of which survive, describes the Western frontier situation in language significantly more candid than anything addressed to the Western Senate or the Western Emperor. He was negotiating from weakness, knew it, and communicated that knowledge privately, while maintaining publicly the fiction of Roman military supremacy. The sack of Rome in 410 AD by Alaric's Visigoths was the moment when the management of public information about the empire's military situation became impossible. Alaric had been a foederati commander, a Roman-trained, Roman-employed barbarian general who had turned against Rome when payment for his services was withheld. The city that had not been sacked in 800 years was sacked by a man who had commanded Roman troops. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the aftermath, addressed the psychological devastation of the event in terms that reveal how completely the Roman citizen population had been insulated from the reality of the empire's military situation. People were not just shocked that Rome had fallen, they were shocked that it was possible. The Western Empire formally ended in 476 AD, when Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and did not bother to appoint a successor, because by that point, the foederati territories within the empire's nominal boundaries were administering themselves, collecting their own taxes, maintaining their own armies, and had no functional need for a Roman emperor to legitimate their authority. The empire had been hollowed out gradually, over a century, in arrangements that were each individually described as Roman policy, and were collectively the empire's dissolution. Roman citizens in the late Western Empire, those who survived long enough to see the transformation, experienced it not as a series of catastrophic defeats, but as a gradual shift in who administered their daily lives, who collected their taxes, who provided their security. The Visigothic kingdom that replaced Roman administration in southern Gaul maintained Roman law, Roman administrative structures, and Roman titles. The transition was so managed, so gradual, and so consistently framed in the language of Roman continuity that many Romans did not experience it as the end of Rome at all, which was, in its way, the final achievement of 5 centuries of sophisticated information management. From the managed dissolution of the Western Empire, we arrive at Rome's longest and most consistently concealed secret, the one the state maintained about the relationship between its public religion and the private beliefs of the people who administered it. What the Pontifex Maximus actually believed. The Roman state religion was a system of public rituals, sacrificial rites, augury, and festival observances maintained by a college of priests who held the most prestigious religious offices in the Republic and Empire. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, a title eventually absorbed by the emperors from Augustus onward, oversaw the entire apparatus. The Flamens maintained the cults of specific gods. The augurs interpreted the will of the gods through the observation of birds and other natural signs. The Vestal Virgins tended the sacred flame that guaranteed Rome's continuity. This was a public, official, politically integrated religion whose ceremonies were performed in public, whose priesthoods were elected political offices, and whose doctrines were, in their basic form, presented to citizens as the genuine theological framework of the Roman world. What Roman citizens were not told, and what the priesthoods maintained as an unspoken institutional understanding, was that a significant portion of the Roman intellectual elite, including many of the men who held the highest priestly offices, did not believe any of it. This is not a modern retrospective conclusion. Cicero, who was himself an augur and who wrote extensively on Roman religion, stated explicitly in his philosophical dialogues, particularly De Natura Deorum, on the nature of the gods, and De Divinatione, on divination, that augury was a system of manipulation rather than genuine divine communication, that the traditional Roman gods were literary and political constructs rather than theological realities, and that the educated Roman elite understood this while maintaining the public religion for its social and political functions. He wrote these texts knowing they would circulate among the educated minority who read Latin philosophical prose, not among the broader citizen population for whom the rituals were maintained. The gap between public performance and private belief that Cicero documents was not unique to his era. The Stoic tradition, which dominated Roman philosophical thought from the 2nd century BC through the 2nd century AD, had a sophisticated theology that bore little relationship to the anthropomorphic gods of official Roman cult. A theology of divine reason pervading the cosmos, of natural law, of the soul's relationship to a universal, rational principle that was not Zeus or Jupiter, but something abstract and impersonal. Senators who performed the rituals of the traditional religion by day read Stoic philosophy by night and maintained the public performances without cognitive dissonance, because everyone who mattered understood that the public religion and the private belief were different registers of the same institutional life. What this meant for citizens who were not part of the educated elite, who took the Sibylline books seriously, who believed that the augur's announcement of favorable omens genuinely reflected divine will, who trusted that the Vestal Virgin's chastity genuinely protected Rome from catastrophe, was that they were participating in a system of public theater whose directors knew it was theater and had chosen not to share this information. The manipulation of augury is particularly well documented. The right of augury, the authority to interpret signs and declare whether they were favorable or unfavorable for a proposed action, was a political weapon of the first order. A general who wanted to postpone a battle could find unfavorable omens. A politician who wanted to delay a vote could have lightning reported. Cicero himself describes colleagues who use the augural system explicitly to block legislation, and describes this without particular discomfort, not because he was unusually cynical, but because everyone in the relevant political class understood the mechanism. Julius Caesar, in his role as Pontifex Maximus before becoming dictator, performed the public religious functions of that office while producing private correspondence and public speeches that reflect a philosophical worldview entirely incompatible with the divine providence those functions implied. Augustus, who reformed the Roman state religion and made the Pontifex Maximus title an imperial prerogative, was a supremely effective manipulator of religious symbolism in political service, building temples, reviving ancient rituals, and commissioning the Aeneid, while producing in his private correspondence preserved by Suetonius observations about fortune and political skill that treat divine favor as a useful fiction rather than a genuine force. The Roman state did not announce to its citizens that the religion was political theater administered by non-believers. It maintained the theater with extraordinary care, invested enormous resources in its performance, and produced some of the most beautiful religious architecture in human history as the stage set for beliefs that the architects and the priests did not hold. The citizens who prayed at those temples, who sacrificed at those altars, who trusted in the omens declared by augurs who knew those omens were manufactured. Those citizens were not deceived by crude cynicism. They were managed by a sophisticated system of institutional maintenance that Rome had perfected over centuries and that survived in modified form long after the empire itself was gone. 10 secrets the Roman Empire kept from the people who lived inside it. The grain dole was political management, not charity, and the people who paid for it never knew they were paying. The military casualty rolls were sealed. The surveillance network had no official name. The treasury had 2 sets of books. The historical record was carved and recarved until the condemned had never existed. The founding myth was assembled from political necessity in the 3rd century BC. The libraries of conquered civilizations were absorbed and selectively destroyed. The slave economy's mathematics were never stated publicly, because stating them would have required acknowledging what Roman prosperity actually cost. The barbarian soldiers who replaced the legions were managed into position over a century until there was nothing left to manage, and the priests who maintained the state religion did not believe it. The mainstream historical view of Rome is that it was a genuinely sophisticated civilization, and that assessment is not wrong. The administrative, legal, and engineering achievements of the Roman state are real, substantial, and in some cases still in use. The roads, the legal framework, the concept of the citizen as a holder of rights, however limited those rights were in practice. These are genuine contributions. But the sophistication extended to the management of information in ways that are rarely the focus of the celebration. Rome was extraordinarily good at knowing what its citizens believed and adjusting what those citizens were told to maintain the beliefs that served the state. The grain dole, the triumph, the state religion, the founding myth. Each was a system of managed perception, maintained not because the state believed its own presentation, but because the gap between the presentation and the reality was exactly what held the system together. What you've seen in this list is not Rome's failure. It is Rome's method. The deception was the achievement. And it lasted, in various forms, for the better part of 1,000 years. Subscribe and stay for more of what the official narrative skips. In the comments, tell me which of Rome's hidden systems you think had the most lasting impact on the world that came after it. Make the case. Rome didn't fall because the barbarians were strong enough. It fell because the gap between what it told its citizens and what was actually true finally became too wide to maintain. Every empire since has faced the same gap. Every one of them has tried the same management. The roads are still there. The propaganda is still there too, just wearing different clothes. Subscribe and keep reading between the lines.